and that's going to be very significant, as we'll see in a few minutes. This had a magnitude of 7.2 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty powerful earthquake. It had an epicenter of 33 kilometers deep and more than 100 aftershocks. The other significant thing is it happened in April. And somebody asked, well, what's important about April? I says, well, it's income tax day. But that's not really the reason. The reason is that in the old days of the Soviet Empire, they would have a huge meeting of the Supreme Soviet in very early May. Every year it was like their big holiday. And so they'd usually, if they were going to do something big, they'd do it right in April, because that way they could have something to kind of brag and beat their chests about at their big meeting. Then, of course, there's scalar waves and supervolcanoes. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the fact that we have our very own supervolcano in Yellowstone. And essentially what you're seeing there on the screen is Yellowstone Falls, and a beautiful place, and that's part of what's called the Yellowstone caldera in geology. And there's been many things on the media, Discovery, whatever, about how there's this enormous magma dome underneath Yellowstone, which supposedly is overdue right now for an eruption. And if it is, it would be like 5 or 10 times worse than Mount St. Helens, minimum. And I had a fellow come up to me at one of the meetings who is a Christian, who's a geologist, and he said, what I'm about to share with you is absolutely true. The geologists know about this, that's why it's going out in the media. The problem is that this caldera in Yellowstone has been targeted already, we are told, by scalar weapons. So they've got it in their crosshairs, so to speak. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is, if you're familiar with a supervolcano, if this thing erupts, first of all, it's going to probably take out most of Wyoming, just in the first few seconds. Probably part of Utah, part of Idaho, part of Montana. The next thing that's going to happen is, because again, we're talking about maybe 6, 7 volcanoes erupting virtually very much close to each other in time. There's going to be huge amounts, tons and tons of ash being sent up into the atmosphere. And because the prevailing winds tend to blow from west to east, it's going to go out over the Great Plains states. And essentially, if you're in the Great Plains states like Nebraska or, even Iowa, you're going to get like 5 to 10 feet of ash dumped on you. And I tell you, I had a colleague in the ministry, Ed Decker, who lived out in Seattle when Mount St. Helens erupted. And he was driving over the Lake Washington Bridge. And he said that stuff was coming down. It was like the worst blizzard you'd ever seen. You couldn't hardly see anything. Cars were skidding around on the bridge. Cars were stalling because this ash gets in the air filter of your car. And it was a mess. And see, that was just one measly volcano. This thing is going to be probably 5 to 10 times worse than that. So you might as well figure that the whole Midwest is going to be wiped out. And that even as far east as Indiana, they're going to still have, a lot of ash and stuff, killing millions and millions of people, millions and millions of livestock, basically wipe out our breadbasket, the whole Midwestern America. And of course, if you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted, it darkened the sky for many days in parts of the country. And it was literally like the book of Revelations, where you could not see the sun. The sun was darkened and the moon looked red at night, because this stuff was up in the sky and it was actually changing the spectrograph of the atmosphere. So, this is one thing you've really got to pray about, folks, because whether or not the scalar waves hit it, supposedly this thing can go off at any time. Then we have the Challenger disaster. This is probably the most spectacular use of scalar weapons against a U.S. target to date. January 28, 1986. We all can remember it. That was the first time a space shuttle blew up. It was one of those catastrophic moments that seared in our memory. And there's every reason to believe that it was part, indeed, of a scalar attack. Why do we think that? Well, basically, there's 3 reasons. First of all, the use of what are called wet runs. Now, what's a wet run? Well, you all know the word dry run. It's when you have a dress rehearsal of something. Well, a wet run, in the case of the military, is when you actually fire the weapon to get the range right, okay? Now, what you need to realize is that the shuttle is kept away from the launch pad until it's approximately ready to be hooked up and launched. They keep it in what's called the vehicle assembly building, which is, I think, the largest building on Earth. And then right before the launch, the day before, they trundle out on this giant railroad car. So that means the day before the launch, there's nothing on the launch pad. And what's interesting is that witnesses reported that they were just wandering around, and they happened to notice that there were these flashes of light around the launch pad. There were cracks and boom-like sounds, or just like a second of an appearance of a white globe of energy, just that quickly, and then it was gone. And people saw it, and well, what the heck, they thought just something out of the corner of their eye, maybe they had a speck in their eye or whatever, and they didn't think anything of it. But then later on, now that we know about what scalar weapons function like, it's very obvious they were trying to get their range right. The other thing is the use of weather technology. We've already talked about how you can use these weapons to change the weather. Well, what happened is that was a record cold week in Florida. And even the conventional scientific community acknowledges that extreme cold had an impact on the shuttle's structural integrity. But there's another factor. You can also use scalar waves to soften metal. And they believe that was also done. So it was like a 1-2 punch. And then the third punch is, of course, when the thing finally lifted off, they sent one of these globes at it, and they materialized it just I was talking about at the beginning of the program, and blew the thing to kingdom come. And we all know what happened. All hands on board were killed. Now this stuff is so powerful, it even has residual after effects. And that's because in order to make this work, you have to have a grid laid down. And there is a grid that's somewhat bizarre in its function. It's called the woodpecker grid. That's been laid over North America since 1976, and it's an energy grid. The Defense Department knows all about it. They can't do a darn thing about it. And when you fire a scalar weapon on this energy grid that's over North America, it causes resonance around the grid nearby. And that's called high-frequency localization signals. And what happened is that animals, those very small brains like birds, are affected by this scalar energy on this grid, and you'll notice there's no birds flying the day of the of the shuttle launch. Also, a few days after that, in the early part of February, nearby, I think it was in Alabama, a little bit away from the shuttle launch area, but it was still, again, resonating on the grid, there was this whole county where all the birds just suddenly dropped dead for no apparent reason. And the Department of Agriculture in the state had no idea why it happened. But it was like every bird and a lot of little rodents and things like that were found dead. No explanation, no viruses, no nothing. So that is, again, a sign that scalar weapons were fired. Now the question then becomes, why are the Soviets way ahead? Why did this happen? Well, part of it is the Soviets paid attention to Tesla, and we basically just ignored him. Also, the Soviets poured billions of dollars and billions of man-hours of research into this. We didn't. And there's a certain level of cultural arrogance on our part. Remember this quote from the beginning? Everything that can be invented has been invented. That's how a lot of scientists think. And as I've said, they just have their minds closed to this sort of reality. Our big mistakes, number one, were assuming the Russians were ignorant peasants. We used to make jokes about that, they're so dumb they make a phonograph record and it goes the wrong way around, or they make a refrigerator over in Russia and you can use it to cook your dinner in. Well, maybe that's true. But you see, the problem over in Russia is that at that time it was a socialist state, and basically they could get away with making crummy stuff because that's all you had. There was no competition.